Now, one of the biggest things you talked about was the blood, and that kinda changed your viewpoint on it. It was the
Yeah,
the blood chemist?
Alan Adler.
Yeah, maybe you could talk about why that was such a big moment for you?
I'll relay that conversation to you then. So I was on the phone with Al Adler. This was 1995, before I built the website, but not long before I built the website. And Al was quite a character, brilliant man, but quite a character. Never drove a car one day in his life. I mean, God gives you this great capacity in your brain, but it's going to take something away to keep us all equal. So Al had to be driven everywhere. He never drove a car. So I'm on the phone with Al, and he was quite a character, as I said. And at one point, I said to him, he said to me, and by the way, just as a very important point, he was the other Jewish guy on the team. Okay. So again, he didn't have a horse in the race. But he said to me in this phone conversation, Barry, he says, I'm getting pretty convinced it's got to be the real thing. Again, he wasn't saying that from a theological point of view, but just based on the science. And I said, yeah, but nobody's explained why the blood on the shroud remains reddish in color, where old blood typically turns brown or even black, sometimes within 30, 40 minutes. And he got angry with me. He said, well, didn't you read my blood paper? And I said, Al, you're a blood chemist and I'm an old hippie photographer. Okay. And I read your paper, but that doesn't mean I completely grasped what you were writing, at least not at the level that he was writing it at. And he said, well, if you'd read my paper, as if I hadn't, if you read my paper, I said that when I did the chemical analysis of the blood stain, I found a high content of bilirubin. Bilirubin is a compound, I believe, made in the liver and pumped into the bloodstream by the liver under certain circumstances. Billy Rubin is not necessarily a Jewish guy from New York, okay? But Adler said that the bilirubin acts as a hemolytic agent. That means it breaks down the cell walls of the red blood cells, releasing hemoglobin, which is what stays red forever. And I went, oh, that was sort of the last piece of the puzzle. Remember, I had access to all the data. And so that sort of shook me because I realized that was really the last big question that had remained unanswered. Now, interestingly enough, in more recent years, Kelly Kearse, who is an immunologist, PhD, brilliant man, tried to duplicate that using bilirubin, did not get the same results that Al Adler claimed. So perhaps Adler was wrong, or perhaps there were factors that were unknown to us that could have had an impact on what Adler said that didn't get transmitted to Kelly Kearse when he did his experiments. So we can't be certain that what Adler saw and what Kearse saw were maybe different things. So, but that was the thing that pushed me over the threshold. And interestingly enough, maybe within days of my having that conversation with Adler, I got another phone call from a friend who kind of jokingly said, well, you know that Shroud thing you're involved with? And I went, yeah, I know that Shroud thing I'm involved with. He said, well, turns out that's just a photo made by Leonardo da Vinci. I laughed. I thought he was joking. And I said, they said, no, I'm serious. So I said, wait a minute. Where did you get that information? He said, well, my wife and I were checking out at the grocery store on one of the tabloids. And that's when I had an epiphany because I realized that here I am sitting on every bit of the actual data based on direct physical examination of that claw. And here's somebody to whom this might be meaningful, having to rely on a tabloid at the checkout counter of the grocery store for his information. And at that moment, while I was still on the phone with the guy, this little idea popped into my head. There was a manila folder on my desk, and I wrote 4 words on that folder: consider building a website. That was the moment that I believe the man upstairs reached down, smacked me upside the head, and said, here's the real job. And that was the catalyst for me to build Shroud.com. So, interesting story and kind of interesting juxtaposition, because it happened right after I became convinced that this was most likely the real thing. And then I get this silly phone call about Da Vinci making it photographically, which of course we've proven wasn't made photographically. But it was the catalyst for me to build Shroud.com.